The complaint arrived in Sorveth Kaan's inbox at the 7th hour, flagged urgent by 3 separate senior scholars, and she read it twice before she believed it. A human servant boy had achieved a perfect score on the Imperial technical assessment, every question correct, not a single error across 8 disciplines, in a hall where the average passing rate among trained Thari candidates was 61%. The scholars who had administered the examination had not waited for the official review period. They had sent the complaint directly to her office, citing procedural irregularity, and used a word she had not seen in a complaint form in 9 years: fabrication. Sorveth set the file on her desk and looked at it for a long moment. She was Examiner-Marshal for the 3rd tier of the Imperial Compact's Technical Review Authority, a title that meant, in practice, that disputed scores landed on her desk, and she decided what was true. She had held the post for 14 years. In that time, she had reviewed 462 disputed assessments. She had overturned 11. A perfect score from a trained candidate was unusual but not unprecedented. A perfect score from a cleaning staff servant who had never attended a formal class in his life was something her categories did not yet have a name for. She opened the file. The boy's name was Pell. No family designation on record. The intake form showed a single name and a registration number from the Trade Exchange Labor Pool, the standard paperwork for human refugees processed through the border station at Veth Crossing. Age 17. Occupation listed as General Service, 3rd tier, the designation that covered cleaning, carrying, and anything else the palace administrative wing needed done. He had been assigned to the examination hall 6 months ago, pushing the cleaning cart and emptying the waste bins between sessions. The assessment itself had not been scheduled for him. That was the first unusual fact. The examination hall ran an open practice session on the 14th day of each cycle, a courtesy provision for any staff member who wanted to attempt an unscored practice run of the technical assessment. Almost no one used it. The practice sessions were designed for junior administrative candidates who wanted to familiarize themselves with the format, not for cleaning staff. Pell had signed the open practice sheet 9 months ago, attended 1 session, and then been told by the hall's duty supervisor. A notation in the margin of the complaint read Preth Voss, senior invigilator, that the practice session was intended for candidates, not servants. He had come back 4 months later and signed the sheet again. Voss had let him sit, apparently, because turning away a quiet 17-year-old with a cleaning cart had seemed like more trouble than allowing it. He had taken the examination on that 2nd attempt. The scores had come back that morning, perfect, all 8 disciplines. 8 scholars had filed a complaint by midday. Sorveth turned to the complaint supporting section. She read the 8 statements in order. The first 3 were variations on the same concern. The candidate had no academic record, no registered training, no institutional history that could account for the scores. The 4th made a more specific claim, that question 47, which concerned load stress failure patterns in suspension couplings, required knowledge found only in the advanced materials distributed to 2nd-year Engineering Institute students, and could not be answered correctly without exposure to those materials. The 5th scholar pointed to question 12, a diagnostic reasoning question about atmospheric system failures, and said the same. The 6th, 7th, and 8th had flagged 6 more questions between them, each tagged with the same marginal notation: source material unavailable outside accredited curriculum. Sorveth read through all 8 statements. Then she set them aside and read the boy's actual answers. She read them slowly. She read them again. There was something in the phrasing she kept returning to, not the correctness of the answers, which was not in doubt, but the texture of them. They did not read like a student's answers. They read like a technician's field notes. The sentence structures were unusual. the terminology occasionally imprecise in one direction and startlingly exact in another, and the reasoning chains moved in a sequence she recognized as practical rather than academic. The order you used when you were standing in front of a broken system and needed to get it running, not the order a professor would diagram on a teaching board. She pressed the intercom. "Send the candidate to my office." He arrived 12 minutes later, still in his service uniform, the plain gray of the general cleaning detail, which carried a faint smell of the bench polish used in the examination hall. He was slight, with the careful stillness of someone who had learned to take up as little space as possible. He looked at her desk rather than at her face, then corrected himself. "Pell," she said. "Yes, Marshal." "Sit down." He sat. He held his hands in his lap with a particular kind of steadiness, not tense, just still, the way a person sits when they are accustomed to waiting and have learned not to let the waiting show. "The scholars who administered your examination have raised a concern," Sorveth said. She did not soften it. "They believe the scores are not consistent with your background." Something moved through his expression, not surprise, a kind of resigned recognition, as though he had been waiting for this particular door to open. "They think I cheated," he said. "They have filed a formal complaint citing procedural irregularity. Under the review authority's rules, I am required to investigate." She folded her hands on the file. "I would like you to answer some questions." He nodded once. Question 47 on the assessment concerned load stress failure in suspension couplings. The scholars believe this question requires exposure to second-year Engineering Institute curriculum. Can you tell me how you came to know the answer? Pell was quiet for a moment. Not calculating, thinking. The way a person thinks when they want to be exact rather than impressive. "I worked maintenance at the Veth Crossing Cargo Depot before the exchange placement," he said. 3 years. We ran Keth pattern suspension rigs on the heavy loaders, the ones with the flat beam coupling system. When a rig was overloaded, the coupling would not fail all at once. It would develop stress signatures first. A particular sound, a vibration in the frame at a specific resonance, a heat pattern at the load point. The supervisors had a machine that was supposed to detect it. The machine was almost always wrong. After about 6 months, I learned to read it by hand. You put your palm on the coupling housing and felt for the resonance frequency shift. The failure pattern the question described was the Keth pattern signature. I recognized it. Sorveth looked at him. Then she pulled question 47 from the file and read the answer he had written. It was technically correct. It was also written in the language of someone who had learned the concept from the thing itself, not from a textbook. The diagnostic sequence was laid out in the order a working technician uses when checking a live system, not the order a student uses when answering an exam question. The phrasing was operational, not academic. She had read over 2,000 assessment answers in 14 years. She knew the difference between a memorized answer and a lived one. She turned to question 12. Atmospheric system failure diagnostics. "The refugee camp at Veth Crossing ran its own atmospheric processors," he said. "Second-hand units, maintenance deferred for 4 or 5 years before we arrived. The main ventilation processor failed twice in the year I was there. There was no authorized technician on site. I was 13 the first time it went down. I figured out the fault by listening to the blower housing. There is a specific pitch change when the primary intake is partially obstructed." The question described an obstructed intake scenario. "I wrote the diagnostic sequence the way you would actually do it, in the order that gets you to the fault fastest." She looked at the answer in the file. He had written the sequence in 7 steps. The Engineering Institute's model answer used 11, 4 of them procedural formalities required by the accreditation standard. His 7 covered the same ground in less time and arrived at the same conclusion. That was not how a student cheated. A student who cheated copied the accredited answer, formalities included. She turned to question 29. Structural integrity assessment in substandard load-bearing materials. He told her about a collapsed section of the transit bridge at the camp's eastern perimeter, what he had noticed about the support columns in the days before it went, the way the surface had begun to sound hollow when struck, the faint lateral movement under foot traffic that no one else seemed to register. A bridge maintenance worker from a neighboring settlement had explained the failure mechanics afterward. Pell had spent 3 months after that reading every physical manual he could find on structural assessment, because he had been afraid of the other bridges, and had wanted to understand what to look for before something else gave way beneath someone he knew. "How many people used that bridge?" Sorveth said. He looked at her with a slight adjustment of expression, as though the question had come from an unexpected direction. "About 60 a day," he said. "It was the main crossing between the eastern and western camp sections." She wrote nothing. She turned to the next flagged question. Question 33 concerned materials fatigue in high-cycle environments. He told her about a water pump assembly in the camp's maintenance bay, how the impeller shaft had been rebuilt twice using salvaged parts that were never quite the right specification, how the mismatch had produced a harmonic vibration at a particular RPM range, and how he had learned to adjust the operating speed to keep the shaft out of that range until a proper replacement could be sourced. He had sourced the replacement himself, eventually, through a trade contact he had cultivated over 8 months, because the adult mechanics on site had stopped trying after the second rebuild. He was 14 years old when he solved that problem. He had not mentioned that detail. Sorveth had done the arithmetic herself. Question 51 concerned thermal management in confined processing systems. He told her about the depot's main control room, which had no functioning cooling system in its 3rd year of operation, and which he and 2 other workers had retrofitted with a passive airflow arrangement using salvaged ducting and a pair of redirected exhaust vents. The depot supervisor had inspected it afterward and said nothing, which Pell had interpreted as approval. Sorveth moved through the remaining flagged questions without pause. He answered each one the same way from the same source, which was not a textbook and not a curriculum, and not any material available outside accredited channels, but was instead a series of problems he had been handed by circumstances, each one harder than the last, each one solved with whatever was available and whatever he had already learned. At the 4th answer, she had stopped writing notes. By the 6th, she understood that the scholars had been, in the precise and limited sense in which the word mattered, wrong. Not dishonest, wrong. The assessment had been designed to test knowledge of principles, and the scholars who designed the complaint had assumed that knowledge of principles came from a particular pathway: formal instruction, curriculum materials, accredited training. They had not considered that a boy could learn load-stress dynamics from 600 repetitions of checking a cargo coupling by hand, or atmospheric failure signatures from 2 years of listening to a processor that was always on the edge of dying, or structural integrity from fear and grief, and the specific urgent education of a person who cannot afford to be wrong. The knowledge was identical, the pathway was not. Sorveth set down her pen. She looked at Pell across the desk. He had been watching her for the past several minutes with a particular attention, not anxious, not calculating, just careful, the way a person watches a machine they have fixed before and are listening to now. "You have been living in the palace service wing for 6 months, she said. "Yes." "In that time, have you attended any formal instruction, used any restricted curriculum materials, or had access to any educational resources not available to general service staff?" "No." "Have you had access to the examination questions before the sitting date, or to any previous examination paper or preparation guide?" "No." She looked at the file. She looked at his face. She had been doing this for 14 years. She could tell the difference, in the way that long experience makes certain differences legible, between a person constructing an answer and a person reporting one. "I am going to make a notation in your file," she said. "The complaint will be marked unfounded. Your scores will stand." He received this with a very controlled stillness. She could see the relief in the steadying of his hands, the slight easing of the line across his shoulders, but he said nothing for a moment. "There is a secondary matter," Sorveth said. He looked at her. "A score of this caliber on the technical assessment qualifies a candidate for placement review under the Compact's skilled labor pathway. It would normally initiate a formal review of your service designation." She paused. "You are currently classified as General Service, 3rd tier." "Yes." "That classification would change. The pathway takes approximately 18 months to complete supervised placements and competency certifications in sequence. At the end of it, you would be eligible for a technical specialist post." She set the file down. "I want to be direct with you. The process exists, but no one has told you it exists, and it is unlikely that anyone in your current position would have found it without assistance. I am telling you now." Pell sat with that for a moment. His hands were still in his lap. "Why?" he said. It was a fair question. Sorveth considered it honestly. "Because the scholars who filed this complaint were wrong in a way that the review authority's processes are designed to catch," she said. "And because your knowledge is real and you earned it, and the record should say so." She leaned back slightly in her chair. "That is what this office is for." He looked at her for a long moment with that same careful attention, reading her the way he read machines, listening for the resonance that meant something true was being said, and not merely something convenient. "Then all right," he said. "Yes." She opened a new form on her desk. "Then let us begin the review." Outside the window, the Compact's administrative towers ran their cycle lights toward evening, and Sorveth Kaan wrote the first line of a file that, across 14 years and 462 disputed assessments, she had never quite expected to hold. Not overturned, not dismissed, not an error corrected and quietly buried. Verified all 8 disciplines, knowledge source confirmed, experiential. She signed it, sent it to the record, and the record stood.